It started with a fall that should have ended everything. Her name is Denise Harper. She is 28 years old, and on her honeymoon, standing at the edge of a mountain in Wyoming, the man she trusted more than anyone placed his hand on her back and pushed. She didn't scream at first, not because she wasn't afraid, but because her mind refused to accept what was happening. 1 second. 1 second she was looking at him, the next, there was nothing under her feet. The sky spun, the wind roared, and his face, calm, distant, almost relieved, was the last thing she saw before she disappeared over the edge. She hit the rocks, hard, her body broke the fall, but it didn't take her life. For 3 months, the world believed Denise Harper was gone. Her family didn't search. They didn't question. To them, she had already disappeared years ago. But she didn't die, and when she finally walked back through that front door, she wasn't prepared for what she would see waiting inside, or who was standing at the altar. Before we get into what really happened, I want to ask you something. What time is it where you are right now? And what city are you watching from? I'm curious to see just how far this story reaches. And if you haven't already, take a second to subscribe and leave a comment, because what you're about to hear only gets worse from here. Before that trip, Denise believed she had finally stepped into a life that didn't feel like a punishment. For most of her childhood, she had been the one no one defended, the one compared, corrected, and quietly dismissed whenever something went wrong. In that house, approval had a pattern, and it never leaned in her direction. Her mother rarely raised her voice, but the disappointment was constant, and her stepfather made it clear, with small remarks, that Denise was always falling short. The real contrast stood right in front of her every day, because Carla was everything the family seemed to want. Polished, agreeable, and effortlessly favored, Denise learned early that attention was something she had to earn, and even when she tried, it never stayed with her for long. Eventually, trying stopped making sense. She left, built her own routine, and cut herself off completely. Not in anger, but in self-preservation. 5 years passed without a single call, and over time, silence became normal, like she had erased herself from that version of her life. Meeting Luke Sanders changed that rhythm in a way she didn't question at first. He didn't come into her life loudly or dramatically, just steady, attentive, and patient in a way she had never experienced before. He asked questions no one had asked, remembered details she didn't think mattered, and made her feel like she wasn't something to fix. That kind of attention doesn't feel suspicious when you've gone without it for years. It feels like relief. Their relationship moved quickly, but to Denise, it didn't feel rushed. It felt certain. For the first time, she wasn't chasing approval. She was receiving it without effort. When he proposed, there wasn't hesitation, because she wasn't just saying yes to him. She was saying yes to a version of her life that didn't include the past she had left behind. What surprised her more was how easily her family reappeared once Luke was involved. The same people who had gone years without reaching out suddenly welcomed her back with open arms, polite smiles, and careful warmth that didn't quite match the history she remembered. Her mother spoke gently. Her stepfather kept conversations neutral. And Carla seemed unusually interested, asking questions about the relationship, about Luke, about everything Denise had built on her own. It should have felt comforting, but something about the timing didn't sit right, like a door reopening too smoothly after being shut for too long. Still, Denise ignored that feeling, because doubt didn't belong in the life she thought she was building. Looking back, the shift was subtle, almost easy to miss. Luke would go quiet at times. Not distant enough to cause alarm, but enough to leave a gap in conversations that used to feel effortless. There were moments when he seemed distracted, like his attention was somewhere else. Even when he was standing right next to her. When she asked, he brushed it off, and she accepted the answers because she wanted to believe the version of him she had chosen was real. Trust, once given that, completely, doesn't break all at once. It bends slowly, almost invisibly, until the moment it finally gives in. The mountains in Wyoming felt different once they were inside them. Not louder, not more dangerous. Just distant in a way that made everything else seem small, to including as the space between Denise and her husband. The resort they chose sat high above the valley, surrounded by long stretches of untouched, where signals dropped without warning, and the roads curved through silence instead of traffic. It was the kind of place people described as peaceful, but for Denise, that quiet started to feel like something else entirely. Something that didn't respond when you tried to break it. At first, nothing was obviously wrong. They followed the same routine most couples would, walking through trails, stopping for photos, sitting across from each other at dinner while planning what came next. But there was a shift that didn't have a clear beginning. Something subtle enough to ignore if you weren't paying attention. Luke didn't withdraw completely. He just stopped meeting her in the same way. Conversations that used to flow now ended early, replaced by pauses that didn't need to be there. When Denise spoke, he listened, but there was a delay in his responses, like his thoughts were somewhere else before they reached her. She noticed it in the way he looked at her. Not cold, not angry, just unreadable. As if something had been decided that she wasn't part of. Once or twice she asked if something was bothering him, and each time he gave an answer that sounded reasonable. Simple explanations that didn't invite further questions. Stress, fatigue. Nothing specific enough to hold on to. Denise accepted those answers because there was no clear reason not to, but the feeling didn't leave. It stayed in the background, quiet, but persistent, growing stronger in moments when he thought she wasn't paying attention. There were small details that didn't belong to the version of him she knew. He checked his phone more often, but never explained why, stepping away just far enough to keep conversations private without making it obvious. At night, when the room was dark and still, he would lie awake longer than usual, facing away from her, breathing evenly but not asleep. Denise noticed because she had always been aware of changes like that, the kind that didn't announce themselves but slowly replaced what used to feel normal. By the second day, she stopped trying to define it and started adjusting around it instead. She smiled when he smiled, stayed quiet when he pulled away, and convinced herself that whatever distance she felt would pass on its own. It was easier to believe that than to question something she had trusted completely. Still, there was a moment that stayed with her, brief but clear, when she caught him watching her from across the room. Not with affection, not with curiosity, but with a stillness that didn't match anything she recognized. When he noticed she had seen him, he looked away immediately, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, he suggested they go higher up the mountain, somewhere with a better view, somewhere fewer people visited. His tone was calm, casual, the same tone he used for everything else, but this time, Denise hesitated for a second, longer than she expected. It wasn't fear, not yet, Just a pause that didn't have a reason attached to it. Then, she nodded, because saying no would have required explaining something she couldn't clearly define. On the third day, the distance between them became something Denise could no longer ignore. The trail Luke chose that morning was narrower than the others, winding upward through uneven ground that required careful steps and steady focus. And yet, he moved ahead with a confidence that didn't match the caution of the path. He didn't offer his hand the way he had before, didn't slow down to match her pace, just kept walking as if he already knew exactly where he was going. Denise followed, not because she felt comfortable, but because turning back alone felt worse than continuing forward beside someone she no longer fully understood. The higher they climbed, the quieter everything became. Not peaceful, but isolated in a way that made every movement more noticeable. The wind was stronger near the top, pushing against her as she stepped closer to where the land opened into a wide, empty drop. Luke stopped near the edge and turned slightly, watching her approach with an expression that didn't carry any of the warmth she had once relied on. There was no anger, no visible tension, just a calmness that felt misplaced in that moment. He told her to come closer, his voice, even, controlled, giving no hint of urgency. Denise hesitated, not long enough to refuse, but long enough for something instinctive to surface, a quiet warning she couldn't fully explain. Still. She stepped forward, closing the space between them, trying to make sense of the silence that had settled around him. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, small rocks shifting as she adjusted her balance, and for a second she focused on that, instead of the unease building in her chest. When she reached him, he didn't move immediately. He stood there, close enough that she could feel the presence of him beside her, but distant in every other way that mattered. Then, without any build-up, without any visible change in his expression, his hand pressed forward against her back. It wasn't a sudden strike, not aggressive, just firm enough to remove her balance at exactly the wrong moment. There was no time to react properly. Her body tilted, her foot slipped on loose gravel, and the ground disappeared before she could correct herself. The world shifted instantly, the horizon breaking apart as she fell backward into open space. The air rushed past her, loud and overwhelming, while her mind struggled to catch up with what had just happened. She reached out instinctively, fingers grasping at nothing, searching for anything that could stop the fall, but there was nothing within reach. For a brief second, she saw him again above her, standing still at the edge, not moving, not calling out, not reacting in any way that suggested this wasn't intentional. That image stayed clear, even as everything else blurred, fixed in her mind as the moment separated her from the life she thought she had. The impact came hard and sudden, cutting off any thought before it could fully form, leaving only the sensation of force, and then a silence that followed immediately after. Everything else faded without warning. When Denise opened her eyes again, the world didn't come back all at once. It returned in fragments, a dull awareness of light, a distant pressure in her body, and the faint sound of voices that didn't belong to anyone she knew. She couldn't move at first, not because she didn't want to, but because her body refused to respond the way it used to. Every attempt to shift, even slightly, brought a sharp reminder that something inside her had changed. Something that wouldn't go back to normal quickly, if at all. The place around her was unfamiliar, a small cabin used by hikers, far from the main trails and even further from anything that resembled a hospital. The people who found her weren't professionals, just a group passing through who noticed something below the ridge that didn't belong there. They spoke carefully, explained things in simple terms, told her she had been lucky in ways that didn't feel like luck at all. Time didn't move clearly in those first days. It stretched and blurred, marked only by moments when she was awake enough to understand where she was and what had happened. They offered her a phone more than once, suggested she call someone, anyone, but Denise refused every time. It wasn't hesitation, it was certainty. The people she could have called were the same people who had already let her disappear once before, long before the fall, long before the mountain. Reaching out to them didn't feel like safety. It felt like returning to something she had already escaped. So she stayed where she was, relying on strangers who asked fewer questions and expected nothing in return. Recovery didn't happen in a straight line. Some days she could sit up without help. Other days even breathing felt heavy and uneven. The physical pain was constant, but it wasn't the only thing she had to deal with. Her mind replayed the moment again and again, not as a blur, but as something precise, something she couldn't misinterpret. The position of his hand, the pressure, the timing, all of it clear, in a way that removed any doubt she might have tried to hold on to. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. As the days passed, that realization settled into something colder, something more controlled. Denise stopped, asking why, because the answer wouldn't change anything. Instead, her focus shifted to what came next. She listened more closely to the people around her, paid attention to conversations about the outside world, about news, about anything that might connect back to the life she had left behind. There were mentions of her name, brief, detached, framed as a tragedy that had already been accepted and closed. 3 months gave her enough time to heal, just enough to stand again, to take careful steps without collapsing, to regain a sense of control over her own body. It wasn't full recovery, but it was enough to leave, enough to return, enough to face whatever had been waiting in her absence. The house stood exactly where she had left it, but everything about it felt altered. The moment Denise stepped closer, the lights inside were too bright for a normal evening, spilling through the windows in a way that suggested something planned, something deliberate. Cars lined the driveway and the street beyond, unfamiliar to her, parked in neat rows, as if people had arrived for a purpose, not a visit. She slowed her steps without realizing it, her body reacting before her thoughts could catch up, sensing that whatever waited inside was not something she could prepare for. The front door wasn't locked. That detail registered immediately, small but unsettling, as if privacy no longer mattered within those walls. Denise pushed it open and stepped inside, the sound of voices reaching her before anything else, layered and steady, filled with a kind of energy that didn't belong to grief or remembrance. It was closer to celebration, controlled but unmistakable. She moved forward carefully, each step measured, not out of fear, but because everything felt slightly out of place, like she had entered a version of her life that had continued without her. The living room had been rearranged. Chairs lined up, decorations placed with intention, soft music playing from somewhere she couldn't immediately locate. People stood in small groups, dressed more formally than the setting required, their conversations low but constant. No one noticed her at first, which allowed her to take in the scene without interruption. There was no sign of shock, no trace of anything that suggested a recent loss had occurred in this house. The atmosphere didn't carry absence. It carried anticipation. Her attention shifted toward the center of the drawn there by movement, by the subtle alignment of people, facing one direction. That's when she saw him. Luke stood near the front, dressed in a way that left no room for interpretation. Composed, steady, positioned exactly where someone would be during a ceremony. For a moment, Denise didn't move, not because she didn't understand what she was seeing, but because understanding it didn't feel possible yet. Then her eyes moved slightly to the side, and everything became clear in a way that removed any remaining doubt. Carla stood beside him, dressed in white, calm, prepared, her posture relaxed, as if this moment had been expected, planned, rehearsed. There was no hesitation in her expression, no sign of conflict, just a quiet confidence that didn't belong to someone stepping into something uncertain. The shift in the room happened slowly. One person noticed Denise, then another, their reactions spreading in silence before any words were spoken. Conversations stopped, mid-sentence, heads turned, and the atmosphere changed, not with noise, but with the sudden absence of it. Luke saw her next. The composure he held until that moment didn't disappear completely, but it fractured just enough to reveal something underneath, something closer to recognition than surprise. Denise walked forward without rushing, each step controlled, her focus fixed ahead. She didn't look at anyone else, didn't react to the movement around her, because none of it mattered compared to what stood directly in front of her. This wasn't confusion anymore. It wasn't disbelief. It was clarity, sharp and immediate, cutting through every unanswered question she had carried with her since the mountain. She stopped within a few steps of them, close enough that there was no distance left to hide behind. No one spoke, no one moved. The entire room held in place, waiting for something that hadn't happened yet. But what came next did not unfold in chaos. It unfolded with precision. Denise did not raise her voice, did not rush forward, did not react the way everyone in that room expected her to. Instead, she spoke clearly, her words steady, directed only at the man standing across from her, telling him that he should have made sure she never came back. The sentence landed heavier than any accusation, because it carried certainty, not confusion, and the effect was immediate. The balance of the room shifted, not through noise, but through the realization that this was no misunderstanding. Luke tried to respond, but his composure failed him in small, visible ways. His posture changed, his voice lost its control, and for the first time since she had entered, there was something unmistakable in his expression, not surprise, not guilt, but fear. Carla remained still beside him, her confidence intact longer than his, but even she could not fully maintain it once the silence in the room turned into attention, focused entirely on them. Denise did not need to explain everything herself, because she had not come back unprepared. From the side of the room, a man stepped forward, someone none of the guests recognized as part of the family. His name was Ethan Cole, and his role became clear the moment he introduced himself, not as a friend, but as legal counsel representing Denise Harper. He did not raise his voice either, did not create a scene, but what he presented carried more weight than any confrontation could. He spoke about records, about timelines, about communications that had been preserved and verified. He described patterns that connected too clearly to dismiss, actions that aligned too precisely to be coincidence. Then came the audio. It wasn't long. It wasn't dramatic. But it was enough. Voices filled the room, familiar to those who knew them, speaking in a way they never expected others to hear. Plans discussed without hesitation. Intentions stated without caution. Details that removed any possibility of reinterpretation. The effect was immediate and irreversible. Conversations broke out, not loudly, but sharply, as people stepped back, distancing themselves from what they were now witnessing. Carla was the first to react with resistance, denying what was being presented, attempting to interrupt, but her words lacked structure, lacked the confidence she had shown before. Luke said less, not because he had nothing to say, but because nothing he could say would undo what had already been heard. The room no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the evidence, to the shift in perception that had already taken place. Law enforcement arrived within minutes, not as an escalation, but as a continuation of what had already been set in motion. There was no confusion in their actions, no hesitation in the way they approached the situation. One by one, the people involved were separated, addressed individually, their reactions no longer hidden behind coordinated silence. The process was controlled, procedural, and final in a way that made it clear there would be no immediate escape from what had unfolded. Denise did not stay to watch everything that followed. She had already seen enough, heard enough, understood enough to know that the outcome no longer depended on her presence. As she stepped away from that house, there was no sense of victory in the way people often imagine it, no relief that erased what had happened. What remained was something more grounded, a clear understanding of what trust had cost her and what it would require moving forward. She did not look back, not because she was trying to forget, but because there was nothing left there that belonged to her. The people she had once tried to reach, tried to understand, had already shown her exactly where she stood in their lives. Walking away was not an act of anger. It was an act of clarity. Later, when she spoke about it, she did not frame it as survival alone. She spoke about recognition, about the importance of paying attention to what people show you when they think you are not looking, about the danger of accepting treatment that slowly convinces you to question your own value. She made it clear that leaving had been necessary long before the mountain, long before the fall, and that returning had not been about revenge, but about closing something that had been left unfinished. In the end, Denise Harper did not reclaim what she lost. She chose not to. What she gained instead was the ability to walk away without hesitation, without doubt, and without any intention of returning to a place that had already decided she did not belong.